When we think about how we watch films in series, today on demand, on any device, without schedules or advertising, the shift feels natural, almost inevitable. But only a few decades ago, none of this existed. The idea that you could choose what to watch, when to watch it, and resume it later without missing anything was revolutionary. And at the center of that revolution is Netflix, a company that started quietly with a surprisingly humble business model and ended up reshaping the entire entertainment industry. Before we begin, take a slow breath in and a soft breath out. Let your shoulders drop and let the day settle a little. And if you enjoy these gentle, calm narrations, and if they help you unwind or fall asleep, you can like the video. And tomorrow morning, when you wake up fresh and rested, leave me a little heart in the comments, just to let me know you'd like more calm pop stories like this one. When you're ready, we can begin. This story begins in the mid-1990s in California. The internet was still young, video rental shops were everywhere, and home entertainment meant VHS tapes, weekend Blockbuster visits, and late fees if you returned anything even a few minutes past the deadline. In that world, Netflix didn't look like a future giant. It looked like a small, strange experiment. The company was founded in 1997 by Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph. There are several versions of what inspired the idea. One popular version is that Hastings, after returning a rented VHS tape late, was charged a substantial late fee. He wondered whether a rental system could work without punishments and deadlines. Another version suggests that the idea came from a brainstorming session. Randolph wanted to build an online business, and the team tested whether DVDs, a brand new technology at the time, could be safely delivered by post without breaking. They famously mailed a CD to themselves as an experiment. It arrived intact, and the idea suddenly seemed feasible. Whatever the exact moment of inspiration, the core vision was simple: an online video shop that shipped DVDs to your door. No late fees, no pressure, no need to physically visit a shop. Netflix launched in April 1998 with just 30 employees and fewer than 1,000 movie titles. Nothing compared to the vast catalogs we're used to today. But it offered something that Blockbuster and other rental stores could not: convenience. Subscribers could browse films online, click to rent, and receive the disc by post. When they were done, they placed the DVD back in a prepaid envelope and mailed it back. Then Netflix would send the next one on their list. It was practical, predictable, and refreshingly stress-free. But the real innovation came in 1999, when Netflix introduced a monthly subscription model. Instead of paying per rental, subscribers paid a flat fee to rent as many DVDs as they wanted, 1 or 2 at a time, with no return deadlines. This small change completely transformed the business. Customers loved the flexibility, and the company finally had a steady, predictable revenue stream. Still, Netflix remained a niche player. Blockbuster dominated the rental market with thousands of stores worldwide, and competitors dismissed the idea of an online-only service. But while Netflix was quietly expanding, the DVD format was spreading rapidly. DVDs were cheaper to ship, harder to damage, and offered higher quality than VHS tapes. The timing was perfect, and Netflix grew quickly through the early 2000s. Behind the scenes, the company was also developing something that would later become its true competitive advantage, an algorithm. Netflix wanted to recommend films to each user based on their individual tastes, encouraging them to watch more, stay subscribed, and discover titles they might not have chosen on their own. In 2000, they launched one of the earliest large-scale recommendation systems in consumer tech. It wasn't perfect, but it was groundbreaking. By 2002, Netflix was strong enough to go public. The initial stock price was just over $15 per share, reflecting cautious optimism. Investors still saw Netflix as a quirky niche business, not a threat to Hollywood's traditional giants. But inside the company, a new idea was taking shape, one that would change everything once again: the possibility of delivering films over the internet. At the time, this sounded unrealistic. Internet speeds were slow, streaming video was unstable, and the idea of watching a full film online without constant buffering felt like science fiction. But Hastings and his team believed that eventually bandwidth would increase and computers would become powerful enough to make online viewing practical. Netflix began preparing long before the technology was ready. Throughout the early 2000s, Netflix continued refining its service. It expanded its DVD library, reduced shipping times, and improved its recommendation engine. The customer base grew rapidly, and the company repeatedly broke its own records for subscriber numbers. Meanwhile, Blockbuster began to feel the pressure. In 2004, Blockbuster launched its own online DVD by mail service, but their timing was too late, and their financial structure, based on thousands of expensive retail stores, was increasingly unsustainable. Netflix, in contrast, had no physical storefronts, lower overheads, and a rapidly growing subscriber base. The shift had begun. But the turning point, the moment when Netflix truly evolved from a rental service into a technology-driven entertainment platform, came in 2007. That year, Netflix launched its streaming service, an online catalog of films and TV shows available instantly on your computer. No shipping, no waiting, and no physical discs. The initial library was small and the video quality modest, but the idea was transformative. For the first time, viewers could click a title and watch immediately. The era of on-demand streaming had begun. In those early days, streaming was seen as a bonus feature to the DVD subscription, not the main attraction. Most users still preferred DVDs because they offered better image quality and a far larger selection. But internet speeds were steadily improving, and Netflix knew that streaming would eventually overtake physical media. They invested heavily in developing the infrastructure and licensing deals needed to support it. At the same time, new devices were emerging: smartphones, connected TVs, gaming consoles, that made it increasingly easy to stream content on different screens. Slowly, almost quietly, viewer behavior began to change. The idea of waiting for a DVD to arrive started to feel outdated. By 2009, Netflix streaming was available on an expanding range of devices, and the shift was undeniable. The company was no longer just a DVD rental service. It was becoming something bigger, a digital platform. This is where the story really accelerates. The next phase, Netflix's explosive growth, its global expansion, and its entry into original content would turn it into a cultural force and one of the most influential companies of the 21st century. But first, the world needed to fully embrace streaming. And Netflix needed to prove that its bold bet on the future was the right one. As the 2010s began, streaming was no longer a niche experiment. It was quickly becoming the center of Netflix's strategy. The company was still sending out millions of DVDs, but internally the writing was on the wall. Physical media had limits, streaming did not. And Netflix understood that if it could build a reliable platform with a large and appealing catalog, it might completely reshape how people consumed entertainment. The first major challenge was licensing. In 2007 and 2008, most studios saw streaming as a minor, low-risk way to earn additional revenue. They viewed it as similar to selling TV rights or cable reruns. At that time, no one believed streaming would become the dominant form of distribution. Because of that, the earliest deals were surprisingly affordable for Netflix, and the company quietly secured access to a growing library of films and TV series. Then came a breakthrough partnership, the deal with Starz in 2008. For a relatively modest amount, around $30 million per year, Netflix gained access to a large catalog of Disney and Sony films, significantly boosting its streaming offering. The value of this deal wouldn't be fully appreciated until years later, when studios raised their licensing prices by hundreds of millions. But at the time, it gave Netflix a massive advantage. As subscribers discovered streaming, usage surged. People loved the immediacy, the lack of adverts, and the ability to jump between episodes without waiting. What surprised Netflix, however, was how streaming changed viewing habits. Instead of watching one episode a week, viewers were watching multiple episodes back to back. This behavior, what we now call binge watching, wasn't invented by Netflix, but the platform made it easier than ever before. By 2010, streaming had overtaken DVDs in terms of total user hours. Even if many subscribers kept their DVD plans, their attention had already shifted. Netflix realized that to support this growing demand, it needed to run more like a technology company than a traditional entertainment business. The engineers became just as important as the people negotiating content deals. That same year, Netflix expanded internationally for the first time, launching in Canada. It was a cautious step, but it proved that the streaming model could work outside the United States. The infrastructure held up, subscriber growth was healthy, and Netflix saw an opportunity. If the world was moving toward digital viewing, there was no reason to limit the service to one country. Internally, however, a storm was brewing. In 2011, Netflix attempted a major shift in its business model. It announced that the DVD by mail service would split into a separate company called Quickster, while Netflix would become exclusively focused on streaming. This rebranding was sudden, confusing, and deeply unpopular. Customers were frustrated by the idea of managing two accounts, paying two separate fees, and losing the simplicity that made Netflix so appealing. The backlash was immediate. Netflix lost hundreds of thousands of subscribers. Its stock price fell sharply, and the company reversed the decision within weeks. The Quickster episode remains one of the biggest missteps in Netflix's history, but it also clarified the long-term vision. Streaming was the future. DVDs were not. Despite the damage, the company recovered quickly. Subscriber numbers stabilized, and the shift from physical to digital continued. But Netflix now faced a new problem. As studios realized the value of streaming, licensing costs skyrocketed. Shows that had once been cheap to acquire suddenly became expensive bidding wars. Worse, studios began to realize that Netflix was becoming a direct competitor. They noticed how much traffic their content generated, and many decided they would rather build their own streaming services than license their best titles to someone else. This was a risk Netflix could not ignore. To survive, the company needed something it could control, something that no one could take away when licensing contracts expired. That answer was original content. The idea wasn't entirely new. Netflix had experimented with small projects before, and data showed that subscribers were more loyal when a platform had unique, must-see titles. But committing to full-scale original programming was a massive gamble. It required enormous budgets, long-term planning, and a skill set that Netflix had never needed before. Still, the timing was perfect. In 2012, Netflix ordered its first major original series, House of Cards, a political drama starring Kevin Spacey and directed by David Fincher. What made the decision surprising was that Netflix outbid traditional TV networks, even though it had never produced a major scripted series. The company relied heavily on its data. It knew viewers loved Fincher's work, political dramas, and the original British version of House of Cards. Based on that information, Netflix believed the series would be a hit. When House of Cards premiered in 2013, it was more than a success. It was a statement. Netflix released all episodes at once, embracing the viewing habits streaming had created. It was the first time a major, high-budget show had been designed specifically for online viewing. Critics praised the production values, subscribers flocked to it, and Netflix proved that it could compete with long-established networks like HBO and AMC. The company didn't stop there. Later in 2013, Netflix released Orange is the New Black, another breakout hit. It appealed to different audiences, earned critical acclaim, and strengthened Netflix's identity as a home for diverse and compelling stories. With every new series, Netflix became less dependent on external studios and more confident in its own voice. By the mid-2010s, the strategy was clear. Netflix was no longer just a distributor. It was becoming a global studio. With streaming adoption accelerating and original content gaining momentum, Netflix decided to push further. It expanded across Latin America, Europe, and eventually almost every country in the world. Local language productions followed. First tentatively, then aggressively. The platform didn't just want global subscribers, it wanted global stories. This period marked Netflix's true transformation from a rental service into a cultural powerhouse. The success of House of Cards and Orange is the New Black opened the door. But the next wave of originals, spanning genres, languages, and audiences, would solidify its status as a leader in the entertainment industry. And soon, the company would launch a series that captured the world's imagination, defined the streaming era, and pushed Netflix to heights no one had predicted. By the mid-2010s, Netflix had established itself as more than a successful streaming platform. It had become a symbol of a new era in entertainment, one where viewers, not broadcasters, controlled the schedule. The success of its first original series proved that audiences were ready to embrace shows released all at once, produced for online viewing, and available worldwide. But Netflix was aiming far bigger than a handful of hit series. The company wanted to become the first truly global entertainment service. The next phase began with an aggressive international expansion. In 2014, Netflix launched in several major European markets, including France, Germany, and the Netherlands. The reception was mixed at first. Many households still relied on traditional TV, and local broadcasters dominated the market. But streaming was gaining momentum everywhere, and Netflix offered something those broadcasters couldn't: a unified library accessible on any device, without advertisements, at a predictable monthly price. The company took what it learned from Canada and Latin America and applied it on a larger scale. It built infrastructure, negotiated local partnerships, and slowly adapted its catalog for each region. The approach was simple but effective. Start with global titles, then gradually introduce local content that resonated with each market. This strategy would later become one of Netflix's biggest strengths. As the company expanded, the competition also intensified. Amazon was investing heavily in Prime Video, Hulu continued to grow in the US, and traditional networks were beginning to consider their own streaming services. But Netflix had a crucial head start. Its technology was reliable, its user interface intuitive, and its recommendation system increasingly sophisticated. Viewers opened Netflix and immediately found something they wanted to watch, often something they didn't even know existed a moment earlier. Still, Netflix understood that relying solely on licensed content was risky. Studios could raise prices, limit rights, or pull entire catalogs. To secure its future, Netflix needed a wide and constantly growing slate of original productions, not just prestige dramas, but sitcoms, documentaries, reality shows, stand-up specials, films, children's programming, and stories in multiple languages. The platform needed to appeal to everyone. This ambition led to a dramatic increase in content investment. Netflix allocated billions of dollars for original productions, betting that a strong library would bring in subscribers around the world. And then came the series that changed everything: Stranger Things. Released in 2016, Stranger Things combined nostalgia, strong characters, and a cinematic atmosphere that appealed to a broad audience. It became a global phenomenon almost instantly. Viewers binge-watched the entire season in a single weekend, created fan theories, shared stills and clips, and turned the show into a cultural moment. Stranger Things demonstrated that Netflix could produce not just high-quality series, but worldwide hits capable of influencing fashion, music, and pop culture. This success encouraged Netflix to accelerate its original strategy. The company launched The Crown, an ambitious historical drama praised for its production values. It introduced Narcos, a gripping biographical series that performed strongly in both English and Spanish-speaking markets. And it released BoJack Horseman, a darkly comedic animated show that developed a dedicated following. Each new project expanded Netflix's identity. The platform was no longer defined by one genre or one demographic. It was building an ecosystem where viewers from different cultures and age groups could all find something that felt relevant to them. At the same time, Netflix began investing heavily in international originals. The goal wasn't just to dub or subtitle U.S. content, but to tell stories created by local writers, directors, and actors. This shift marked a turning point. In 2015, Netflix produced its first non-English original, Club de Cuervos, a Mexican comedy drama. Soon after came 3% from Brazil, Dark from Germany, and Sacred Games from India. These series weren't just successful locally, they attracted global audiences, proving that viewers were open to watching content in different languages. The algorithm played a key role, recommending international titles to users who might never have searched for them. For the first time in entertainment history, a Spanish thriller, a German sci-fi series, or an Indian crime drama could reach tens of millions of people worldwide on the same day. This global approach gave Netflix an advantage that traditional studios struggled to match. It was no longer just exporting American content. It was supporting local industries, discovering new talent, and building cultural bridges between different regions. The success of Money Heist, originally a modest Spanish TV series rescued by Netflix, became the perfect example. After Netflix acquired it, the show became one of the platform's most watched titles ever, with fans from Asia to South America. While Netflix was expanding creatively, it was also investing massively in technology. The platform improved its streaming quality, introduced offline downloads, and refined its recommendations using advanced machine learning. Personalized rows, categories, and thumbnails helped guide users toward content that matched their individual tastes. By the late 2010s, Netflix's interface had become a standard that many competitors later adopted. With millions of new subscribers joining each year, Netflix faced a new challenge: the arrival of major studio-owned streaming services. Disney announced Disney Plus, Warner Bros. Prepared HBO Max, and NBC Universal launched Peacock. These companies began pulling their most popular titles from Netflix, shows like Friends, The Office, and Disney's vast catalog of films. Yet, Netflix anticipated this trend years earlier. Its heavy investment in original content was designed precisely for this moment. Instead of relying on external studios, Netflix now had a robust library it fully controlled, from children's animation to blockbuster films. By 2019, Netflix had become a global powerhouse with a subscriber base spread across every continent except mainland China. It had transformed from a small DVD by mail service into a company capable of influencing culture, technology, and media consumption worldwide. But the story wasn't finished. The next phase, massive investments in original films, fierce competition, and new shifts in viewer behavior, would test Netflix's ability to stay ahead in an increasingly crowded industry. And soon, the world would face an unprecedented event that would change entertainment habits overnight, pushing Netflix into a role no one had predicted. When Netflix first introduced streaming in January 2007, it didn't look anything like the platform we know today. At the time, it was simply called Watch Now, and it worked more like a small add-on to the DVD by mail subscription. Customers didn't pay extra for it. Instead, they received a limited number of streaming hours per month depending on the plan they had chosen. The catalog was tiny. A few thousand titles, mostly older films, niche documentaries, and past seasons of television shows. For Netflix, it wasn't about having blockbusters yet. It was about proving that streaming could work reliably on a standard home internet connection, something far from guaranteed in the mid-2000s. Connections were slower, buffers were longer, and the idea of instantly watching a film without downloading it felt almost futuristic. But Netflix understood something that most of the entertainment world still underestimated. Once technology makes convenience possible, audiences rarely go back. People loved the novelty of clicking and watching immediately. They didn't need to wait for a DVD to arrive. They didn't need to return anything. It wasn't perfect, but it was effortless. And Netflix had spent the previous decade building what was, at the time, one of the world's most sophisticated recommendation systems. So even with a small catalog, the platform was able to present users with titles tailored to their preferences. For the first time, a streaming service could feel personal. The next 2 years were crucial. Netflix began negotiating the streaming rights to more recent TV shows, something that required a completely new kind of licensing arrangement. Hollywood studios didn't yet view streaming as a threat. Some even considered it a minor experimental revenue stream. That attitude would change drastically later, but in 2008 it worked in Netflix's favor. The first major strategic win arrived when Netflix secured licensing deals with premium networks and major studios for older seasons of popular TV shows. One example made a dramatic impact: The Office US. When it arrived on Netflix, it found a new life. A show that had performed modestly on traditional television suddenly became a cultural staple for a younger audience that hadn't watched it live. This pattern would repeat itself again and again. Netflix gave shows a second chance, and viewers rewarded them with huge numbers. In these years, Netflix also launched on more devices. At the start, streaming worked only on a web browser. But soon, Netflix apps appeared on the Xbox 360, the PlayStation 3, the Nintendo Wii, and later on smart TVs. The company realized that the real opportunity was to become a universal app, available everywhere, not just on computers. The idea was simple. Netflix should feel like television, something you turn on from your couch, but with the flexibility of the internet. This shift made streaming a household behavior rather than a tech novelty. Even as streaming grew, Netflix continued to expand its DVD operations. In fact, the mail order service reached its peak around 2010, with more than 20 million subscribers renting discs. The company still relied heavily on this revenue to finance its streaming expansion. But leadership understood that physical media had a limit. DVDs could be scratched or lost. Shipping costs were high. And even with the most efficient logistics network, DVDs could never compete with instant access. The real future was digital. To understand how bold Netflix's strategy was, it helps to remember that the entire entertainment landscape was shifting. In late 2010, Blockbuster filed for bankruptcy. For decades, Blockbuster had been synonymous with home entertainment. At its peak, the chain operated more than 9,000 stores worldwide. Netflix didn't kill Blockbuster on its own. But Netflix did something Blockbuster struggled to do: adapt quickly to changing consumer behavior. Netflix had embraced mail order rentals when Blockbuster resisted. Netflix had embraced subscription when Blockbuster still focused on late fees. And now, Netflix was betting aggressively on streaming, while most of the industry still believed DVDs would dominate for years. Renting a movie at a shop, which once felt like a weekly ritual, suddenly seemed unnecessary. Netflix wasn't just building a service, it was reshaping habits. By 2010, streaming had moved from an experiment to a central pillar of Netflix's strategy. That year, the company began referring to itself not as a DVD company, but as a streaming company that also offered DVDs. Behind the scenes, enormous investments were being made in servers, data centers, and partnerships with internet service providers. The more smoothly Netflix worked, the more likely people would adopt it as their primary way of watching films and shows. Netflix also began its international expansion. The first stop was Canada, chosen because it was close, English-speaking, and a good test market. The launch in September 2010 was a success. Canadians embraced streaming quickly, demonstrating that Netflix's model wasn't just a U.S. phenomenon. This early win gave Netflix the confidence to expand further into Latin America and Europe in the years that followed. But the streaming world was changing fast, and the company faced a new challenge that would force it to rethink everything. Streaming was working. Too well, in fact. As Netflix grew, studios suddenly realized that the company was becoming a competitor, one that could reduce traditional TV ratings, alter box office demand, and shift the value of syndication rights. Licensing prices rose sharply. Shows that Netflix once acquired cheaply were now far more expensive. Some studios began pulling their catalogs entirely, preparing to launch platforms of their own. This created a very real threat. Without a reliable way to secure long-term access to popular titles, Netflix needed a new strategy, one that would change the company forever. As the 2010s moved forward, Netflix entered a delicate moment. It had the audience, the momentum, and the reputation for being the future, But it still didn't fully control its own destiny. The catalog depended on studios that, year after year, were becoming less and less willing to license their best content to a growing competitor. Internally, Netflix knew that borrowing content would never be a long-term solution. The future had to be built on something no one could take away: original productions. This shift didn't begin as a dramatic revolution. It was more a slow, careful realization. If Netflix didn't invest in its own library, one day the streaming world could collapse under its feet. And so a new strategy started forming. Netflix would become a studio, not just a platform. It would learn, experiment, make mistakes, and absorb the language, the rhythm, and the risks of Hollywood. The first real test arrived in 2013. Netflix released a political drama about power, ambition, and manipulation in Washington, adapted from a British series from the 1990s. It was expensive, prestige-driven, and designed to make one clear statement: Netflix could compete with the big studios on quality, not just quantity. That series was House of Cards. It didn't just perform well, it changed everything. Critics praised it, viewers binge-watched it, and the industry quickly understood the message. Streaming wasn't a side experiment anymore. It was a real player. Then came Orange is the New Black, a completely different story, tone, and audience, yet equally successful. Suddenly, Netflix had two massive hits, both exclusive, both shaping a new identity. The platform wasn't simply the place where you watched shows. It was becoming the place where shows were born. And that subtle shift changed viewer expectations. People weren't just paying for the catalog anymore. They were paying for the possibility of new worlds, new characters, new stories. Behind the scenes, the company kept pushing forward. Data, which had always been Netflix's secret advantage, became a guiding tool for deciding what to make next. Not to dictate creativity, but to reduce risk. To understand what genres people were drawn to, which actors they responded to, which themes kept them watching. It wasn't an exact science, but it made planning less chaotic. And the more data Netflix gathered, the bolder it became. By the mid-2010s, Netflix wasn't cautiously releasing originals anymore. It was producing at a scale that traditional studios found almost impossible to match. Dozens of series, stand-up specials, documentaries, children's programs, and films were coming out every month. Some were hits, some were misses, some disappeared quietly. But the volume created something powerful, unstoppable momentum. People opened Netflix expecting something new, and most of the time they found it. This aggressive growth did come with a cost. Budgets grew, expectations rose, and the company took risks that didn't always pay off. But it also allowed for creative experiments that would have been impossible anywhere else. Shows like Stranger Things, which blended nostalgia, horror, science fiction, and childhood adventure, might never have been approved by a traditional network. Yet Netflix took the chance, and it became a cultural phenomenon. As the decade continued, Netflix evolved from a disruptor into an institution. It had become part of people's daily routines. Opening Netflix at the end of the day was as normal as turning on the television once was. And with this new role came a new challenge: staying ahead while everyone else rushed into the same race. Netflix had been the first to truly bet on streaming, but it wouldn't be the last. Soon, competitors would multiply, each one pulling back their content to launch their own services. Netflix had predicted this moment years earlier, and that long preparation would soon become essential for its survival. By the late 2010s, the streaming landscape began to change faster than anyone expected. For years, Netflix had moved almost alone, expanding quietly while the traditional studios underestimated the power of on-demand viewing. But the moment the studios realized how valuable streaming had become, they all made the same decision. If Netflix could build an empire with their content, then they could build one too. The consequences were immediate. Shows and films that had lived on Netflix for years began to disappear. Contracts were not renewed. Libraries were pulled back, piece by piece, like someone slowly emptying a bookshelf. At first, viewers barely noticed. But internally, Netflix understood what was happening. The golden era of cheap licensing was ending, and the studios were preparing to compete directly. Disney was the first giant to make a decisive move. In 2017, it announced that it would pull all its titles, from Pixar to Marvel to Star Wars, and build its own platform. The announcement sent a shockwave through the industry. Disney's library had always been one of Netflix's most watched collections. Losing it wasn't just a financial hit, it was symbolic. A door had officially closed. Other studios followed. NBC Universal prepared Peacock. Warner Media reshaped HBO into a broader streaming service. Paramount launched Paramount Plus. Amazon and Apple, meanwhile, had quietly stepped into the market with their own original production strategies. Suddenly, Netflix was surrounded. The space that once felt open and infinite now felt crowded and competitive. But Netflix had one advantage. It had been preparing for this moment for years. The aggressive investment in original content, once seen as risky, was now a necessity. Because while competitors fought to build platforms around their existing catalogs, Netflix had already built a brand identity independent from any single studio. People didn't think of it as a digital library anymore. They thought of it as a destination. Still, the pressure was real. For the first time since its transformation, Netflix had to defend its position. Costs were rising, competition was multiplying, and the novelty of streaming had faded. Viewers began subscribing to several platforms at once, watching selectively, canceling often. The game had changed. Loyalty was no longer guaranteed. To stay ahead, Netflix expanded globally at a speed that surprised even insiders. Instead of relying solely on American productions, it invested heavily in local storytelling, country by country. Spanish thrillers, Korean dramas, French comedies, British mysteries, Italian crime series, they all became part of the same ecosystem. And something unexpected happened. Local shows didn't just work locally, they traveled. A Korean survival drama became one of the biggest global hits of all time. A Spanish heist story turned into a phenomenon. Series from Germany, the UK, Mexico, and Japan found fans in places where those languages had never been popular. Netflix had unlocked something new: global television without borders. This international growth wasn't just strategy, it was survival. As Hollywood pulled away, Netflix built a second pillar strong enough to stand on its own. And with this foundation, the company moved into the 2020s with a sense of both confidence and caution. It had navigated piracy, mail-order DVDs, licensing wars, and the rise of competitors. But the next chapter would bring even bigger challenges and unexpected alliances that would reshape the streaming world once again. Starting in the early 2010s, Netflix understood that licensed content from legacy studios was both its lifeline and its biggest vulnerability. Almost every time a hit series exploded on the platform, the same question followed: how long can they keep it? And the truth was, not very long. Studios were happy to take Netflix's checks, but nobody wanted to give away permanent control of their crown jewels. Warner Bros. Was one of the clearest examples. For years, its catalog had quietly worked wonders on Netflix's algorithm. Older sitcoms, familiar dramas, predictable comfort shows, the kind of content people keep on in the background, became part of Netflix's daily rhythm. In the US, shows like Friends and The West Wing didn't just perform well, they anchored entire viewing habits. In Europe, other Warner-owned titles played a similar role. Not flashy, not new, but stable. The kind of content that keeps subscribers from canceling. But by 2014, Warner Bros. Was already reconsidering. Streaming was no longer a niche experiment. It was becoming the future. The idea of licensing out their catalog indefinitely started to feel like building someone else's empire. So Warner began shortening licensing windows, raising prices, and quietly testing its own platforms. Netflix could feel the ground shifting. The end of Friends on Netflix became symbolic of the broader change. For Netflix, it was a reminder that popularity didn't equal ownership. The moment Warner decided to pull it for its own service, Netflix had no leverage. And this pattern repeated itself with other studios. Every major entertainment company wanted its own streaming platform, its own audience, its own subscription fees. Licenses that Netflix once renewed almost automatically became multi-million-dollar negotiations with strict time limits. So Netflix responded the only way it could. It doubled, tripled, and then essentially bet the entire company on original productions. If they couldn't keep the shows everyone loved, they needed to create the next generation of shows people would love just as much. House of Cards and Orange is the New Black were only the beginning. The real shift came later, when Netflix started investing not in occasional prestige hits, but in a full production pipeline, capable of releasing something new every single week. The Warner Bros. Situation accelerated that change. Losing those titles wasn't just losing content, it meant losing reliability. People watched them in huge volume. They provided predictable engagement, predictable retention, predictable renewal behavior. Originals, by definition, were riskier. Every new series could be a hit, but it could also disappear without a trace. And production costs were enormous. Still, Netflix didn't really have a choice. The studios had made their decision. They wanted their libraries back. Paradoxically, the more Netflix grew, the more it pushed its suppliers to become competitors. By 2017, the industry was quietly reshaping itself around that reality. Warner was preparing what would eventually become HBO Max. Disney was pulling its content to build Disney Plus. NBC Universal was developing Peacock. Paramount was planning its own platform. And Netflix, which once positioned itself as the future of television, found itself surrounded by companies who had decided to build their own futures instead of renting them out. This period is one of the most defining in Netflix's history because it marks the moment the company fully transformed from a distributor into a global studio. It wasn't optional. It was survival. Without originals, Netflix would always be vulnerable to whatever decision a company like Warner Bros. Made behind closed doors. With originals, it had control, expensive control, unpredictable control, but control nonetheless. The irony is that even after launching their own platforms, many studios eventually came back to Netflix with selective licensing deals. But by then, the dynamic had changed. Netflix still appreciated these partnerships, but it no longer depended on them. The Warner Bros. Catalog had shaped Netflix's past. Originals would shape its future. As Netflix expanded internationally, the shift toward original content became even more important. Licensed catalogs were messy across borders. A show Netflix had in the US might belong to a different distributor in France or Spain or Brazil. The rights were fragmented, expensive, and full of complications. It was impossible to build a consistent global offering based on licenses alone. Originals solved that problem instantly. One production, one contract, one global rollout. And for a company that wanted to grow in every market at the same time, this wasn't just convenient, it was fundamental. The turning point came when Netflix realized that the next wave of growth wouldn't come from American subscribers anymore. The US market was reaching saturation. The competition was intense. Every streaming service was fighting for the same few hours of people's evenings. But internationally, whole continents were still open territory. Countries like India, Japan, South Korea, Italy, and Mexico became central in Netflix's strategy, not secondary. To succeed there, Netflix needed not only global hits, but also local stories told by local talent. This led to the rise of what the company called local originals. In practice, it meant commissioning series directly from creators who understood their own markets better than any American executive ever could. Some of these projects were small experiments. Others became global sensations almost overnight. La Casa de Papel, which originally aired in Spain, only became a worldwide phenomenon after Netflix acquired it and re-edited it for a global audience. Dark put German sci-fi on the international map. Sacred Games brought Indian prestige drama to a completely new level. And in South Korea, Kingdom and later Squid Game proved just how powerful a single local story could be when given global reach. For Netflix, the success of these shows confirmed a theory they had long suspected. Great stories don't need to be in English to work everywhere. The algorithm didn't discriminate. If people liked something, it spread. And if it spread, it became part of the global cultural conversation. That was something traditional studios had never managed to do at scale. The old model assumed that international hits had to be American hits first. Netflix turned that logic upside down. But this expansion came with huge financial consequences. Producing originals in dozens of countries meant constant spending, constant risk, and constant pressure to deliver. Netflix wasn't just buying finished series, it was financing them from the ground up. Productions ran simultaneously on multiple continents. Budgets grew. The number of releases skyrocketed. Internally, the company described this phase as building the world's first internet studio, a phrase that sounded ambitious but was, in many ways, painfully accurate. The company's critics argued that Netflix was burning money faster than it could earn it. They pointed to rising debt, ballooning content costs, and the simple fact that many originals never became hits. For every breakout series, there were dozens that quietly disappeared. But Netflix believed the long-term payoff was worth it. Owning a global library of originals meant long-term control. It meant not relying on studios pulling licenses at the last minute. And it meant that subscribers in Tokyo, Sao Paulo, Milan, and Cairo could all feel like Netflix was made for them, not just imported to them. This was the moment Netflix's identity became irreversible. It wasn't a distributor anymore. It wasn't a digital blockbuster. It had become something closer to a multinational entertainment powerhouse, operating at a scale no traditional studio had ever attempted. And with that transformation came a new tension: how to keep growing without losing the simplicity that made Netflix appealing in the first place. As Netflix evolved into this global entertainment machine, the pressure to keep expanding never really stopped. Growth had become part of the company's identity. Every quarter needed more subscribers, more hours watched, more markets entered, more originals released. But there was a limit to how far that model could stretch before the cracks became visible. The first clear sign appeared when subscriber growth in the US began slowing down. Not collapsing, slowing. But for a company whose valuation depended on endless expansion, even a slowdown was treated like an alarm bell. Analysts questioned whether Netflix had reached its peak. Competitors sensed an opportunity. And Netflix itself began confronting a reality it had avoided for years. There was no longer an infinite pool of new subscribers waiting just beyond the horizon. At the same time, production costs kept rising. Originals were now a central pillar, not an occasional experiment. Big projects demanded big budgets. Local productions required strong regional teams. Marketing had to scale across dozens of languages. And because Netflix released so many new titles, each one had a shorter window to prove itself before the next wave arrived. Even successful shows often struggled to build long-term momentum, simply because there was always something new. Internally, executives began discussing efficiency, a word rarely associated with Netflix's earlier years. The company knew it couldn't maintain a strategy built entirely on more. It needed a way to stabilize without losing what made it competitive. So Netflix started experimenting with tools that had long been part of traditional television: weekly episode releases, staggered seasons, mid-season splits. Each of these approaches created breathing room. They slowed down the consumption cycle, extended the conversation, and kept people subscribed for longer. But the most significant shift came when Netflix introduced an advertising tier. For years, this was considered unthinkable. The whole appeal of Netflix had been its simplicity: one price, everything included, no ads. It was the clean alternative to cable. But the economics of streaming were changing. The company needed a new revenue stream that didn't depend on perpetual subscription growth. And advertisers wanted access to Netflix's huge audience. The ad-supported tier was a pragmatic move, not a philosophical one. It allowed Netflix to offer cheaper plans to more price-sensitive countries and younger viewers, while also opening a completely new income channel. And it worked. Within a short time, the ad tier became one of the fastest-growing parts of the business. It didn't replace subscriptions, it reinforced them. Meanwhile, password sharing, a long-standing open secret, became another area where Netflix had to change its approach. For years, the company tolerated it, even joked about it on social media. But by 2022, the numbers were too large to ignore. Millions of people were watching without paying. Cracking down on sharing was controversial, but it had a measurable impact. Many of those viewers eventually converted into paying subscribers, proving that the decision, however unpopular, made financial sense. These changes didn't transform Netflix overnight, but they marked a noticeable shift. The company was no longer the rebellious upstart trying to overthrow traditional television. It was now the incumbent, adjusting to its own maturity. Netflix had never been afraid to experiment, whether with release models, pricing, or content strategy. And in this phase, that adaptability became its biggest advantage. And yet, even as Netflix adjusted its business model, its biggest challenge remained the same: how to keep people engaged when the competition was everywhere, the content was infinite, and attention was more fragmented than ever. The answer would arrive in a form no one fully expected: a reminder of how quickly this industry could change. The reminder arrived in the form of something surprisingly simple: a single global hit. In an era dominated by algorithms, data, cost analyses, and strategic shifts, Netflix's biggest breakthroughs still came down to the unpredictable force of a show capturing the world's attention. And in 2021, that show was Squid Game. Nobody, not even Netflix, fully anticipated what would happen. The series was produced on a modest budget by South Korean standards, created by a director who had spent years trying to get it made, and released without the massive marketing campaigns that usually accompany big international launches. But within days, the show began spreading across countries, languages, and demographics. It was the kind of cultural moment that couldn't be planned. It just happened, and when it did, it revealed something crucial about the streaming era. Global hits were no longer defined by Hollywood. They could come from anywhere, in any language, at any time. And Netflix was uniquely positioned to benefit from that shift. No other platform had the same global infrastructure, the same simultaneous release model, or the same willingness to push local productions onto the world stage. Squid Game didn't just boost numbers, it reshaped Netflix's confidence. It validated years of investment in local storytelling. It proved that a streaming platform could launch a non-English language series into the same cultural space once reserved for American blockbusters. And financially, it demonstrated the value of ownership. A single global phenomenon could deliver enormous returns without the costs and limitations of licensing. At the same time, the rise of these mega hits highlighted a difficult truth for Netflix. Success was becoming increasingly unpredictable. For every global sensation, dozens of titles failed to find an audience. Even well-made series struggled to stand out in a catalog that grew larger every week. And because Netflix released so many originals, each new show risked being overshadowed by whatever came next. The company had created a world with infinite choice, but infinite choice came with its own problems. This tension pushed Netflix to refine its algorithmic approach. The goal wasn't just to recommend content, but to personalize the entire experience. Artwork, trailers, category rows, everything became dynamic. For some viewers, a series would appear as a romance, for others as a thriller. A single show could effectively become multiple shows, simply depending on who was looking at it. And this personalized experience became one of Netflix's most powerful tools. Competitors could copy the strategy, but few had the same depth of data or the same scale to train on. At the same time, Netflix began to think about engagement beyond traditional series and films. Interactive specials like Bandersnatch hinted at new possibilities. Stand-up comedy grew into a major vertical. Documentaries became a global staple. And something else started quietly gaining traction: games. Streaming might have been the foundation, but Netflix understood that it was ultimately competing for attention, not just viewership. If people were spending their evenings on games rather than shows, then games were part of the entertainment landscape Netflix needed to explore. Still, no matter how much the company expanded or diversified, its core challenge remained the same: staying relevant in a world where every entertainment company, old or new, wanted the same audience. And as the 2020s progressed, the competition only intensified. Disney Plus, HBO Max, Prime Video, Apple TV Plus, Peacock, Paramount Plus, and even platforms like YouTube and TikTok all fought for the same limited hours of human attention. For Netflix, competing in this environment meant accepting a new phase in its evolution. The era of explosive subscriber growth was fading. The era of strategic endurance was beginning. It was no longer about being the newest or the boldest. It was about being the most adaptable, the service people kept returning to even when the novelty of streaming had worn off. By the mid-2020s, Netflix had settled into a very different identity than the one it started with. It wasn't the scrappy DVD by mail service anymore. It wasn't just the disruptor that convinced millions of people to abandon scheduled television. And it wasn't simply the studio trying to replace the libraries of Hollywood. It had become something more stable, more predictable, and in some ways more grown up. The company that once relied on licensing deals now relied on its own catalog. The platform that once measured success by subscriber growth now measured it by engagement, retention, and the slow but steady buildup of recurring revenue. The business that once feared the power of legacy studios had become a legacy force in its own right, shaping trends instead of reacting to them. And yet, through all the changes, the originals, the algorithms, the global productions, the ad tier, the password rules, the new competitors, the shifting economics, the core idea stayed surprisingly simple. Make it easy for people to watch something they enjoy. That simplicity is what guided Netflix through its most dramatic transformations. It's what allowed a small company to challenge an entire industry. And it's what kept the service relevant even when streaming became crowded, complicated, and fiercely competitive. Today, Netflix occupies a space that didn't exist before it. Part technology company, part global studio, part distributor, part cultural engine. It is criticized for releasing too much content, praised for breaking international barriers, questioned for its spending, admired for its reach, and constantly analyzed for whatever it does next. But whether viewed as pioneer or incumbent, disruptor or establishment, one thing is clear. It changed how the world watches television. And perhaps that is the most defining part of its legacy. Not any single show or any single strategy, but the simple fact that it reshaped the everyday habit of watching. People press play differently now. They choose differently. They expect differently. And every service that came after, from Disney Plus to Apple TV Plus, exists in a world Netflix helped create. The story of Netflix isn't finished because the company is still adapting to whatever the entertainment industry becomes next. But the journey from mailing DVDs to producing global hits is, on its own, one of the most unusual transformations in modern business. A mix of ambition, risk, missteps, reinvention, and sometimes just being early at the right moment. If streaming is now part of normal life, Netflix is one of the main reasons why. And whether the future brings new competitors, new technologies, or new ways of watching, the company remains rooted in the idea that got it started. Give people an easier, more flexible way to enjoy stories. And trust that if the experience is good enough, they will keep coming back.